I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast where we go behind the headlines to cover news and information that the old mainstream legacy media really does not want you to know about. We try to recover some lost history and explain the inexplicable. Today I'm very fortunate because I have Simon Hankinson with me, who is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation on border security issues. Welcome to On Watch, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
So, the new Trump administration, the golden age has begun. The president has signed a bunch of executive orders and issued direction to his staff. We have Tom Homan as the border czar. You're sitting in a position at the Heritage Foundation where you've watched Biden destroy the border. What's the task ahead for President Trump, Tom Homan, and all of our law enforcement in trying to restore some kind of a sense of security at the border?
It's a monumental task. It was 12 labors that Hercules had. This is like a 13th labor. It's Humpty Dumpty didn't fall off the wall this time. If Humpty Dumpty is the rule of law and border security, he got shoved off with extreme prejudice and fell at high speed. So there's an awful lot of work to do to glue him back together again. It's not going to be easy, and it may not get to 100%, but I really think that President Trump came in this time with a team and a plan and a lot of bitter experience, and they will make an extraordinary amount of progress. We've already seen just in the last 4 days a slew of executive orders and policies that have gone a long way towards restoring the rule of law and border security.
How big of a factor do you think self-deportation will be? How many people do you think are going to say, you know what, I don't want to get swept up in this, I'm just going to take a bus and head south? I mean, is that a good factor? Is that a big piece of it?
I do think it's a big piece of it, but it's two different types of, let's call it, voluntary departure. There's the people who are here who know they don't have a case. They know they're just here to work, and they don't have an asylum claim that could possibly survive scrutiny. And you have criminals. You've got people who know that when they get caught, things are going to get ugly.
Right.
They'll want to go home. And then you've also got a lot of people who just won't come, and that's a probably much larger number, who are somewhere in the pipeline that previously they knew they had a 90% chance of being released as soon as they got to the border. So they're coming from India, from West Africa, places that are poor perhaps and don't have fantastic governments, but are not places where you could legitimately make an asylum claim, which is the only excuse that Biden had for letting them in.
Right.
I do think the word's going to get out. You're paying. I've met people down on the border being released from China, from Kazakhstan, from India, and I've spoken to a few of them, and they're all clearly economic migrants. They're not fleeing anything, and they've paid a package of $10,000-$15,000 to fly from China or from India to Nicaragua, say, or somewhere in Central America, and have a bus ride and hotels and everything right up to the border. They're not going to borrow that money from relatives if they don't think there's at least a 50% chance of being released. And as soon as that number goes down, we are going to see people voluntarily decide not to try to game the asylum system.
Right. President Trump signed an order designating cartels, which he used to refer to as transnational criminal organizations, which they are, but I think more accurately, he's designated them now as foreign terrorist organizations. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. What qualifies as a terrorist organization versus a transnational criminal organization is a distinction that we could debate for hours. I think what that recommendation does, and as far as I understand it, he's asking for reports from Homeland Security and other agencies so that he can then decide to make that designation. I'm not sure that it's actually been formally made, but it allows, just like the declaration of emergency and the declaration of an invasion at the southern border, the president to access resources from the Department of Defense, for example, that were not available before. And I mean, if you look at the behavior of the cartels, it really does cross the line beyond just regular criminality. I mean, the other day they raided a train traveling through the south. I think it was in Arizona at the time, and it was an organized criminal raid where they just looted it. They had watchmen, they had trucks and cars ready to take the stuff off.
Right.
Yesterday, there was a hiker in the Jocumba Hot Springs area, which I visited, who was shot by a couple of cartel operatives who were, on U.S. soil. They just feel like they can act with impunity, they can carry out their objectives and make money. So I'm really glad to see it being taken seriously and resources put towards trying to stomp on these guys, because they have been mocking us for 4 years, and it's embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, literally years ago, maybe 10, maybe 8 years ago, I took a congressional delegation, very small one, down to Arizona and pointed out to them, and they actually got to see guys running away and being apprehended, who were cartel spotters sitting on mountaintops in Arizona looking south, because they were essentially the guides, or the pathfinder element, looking south and guiding drug loads north. And they would look out and see who's patrolling where from these vantage points. And so, when you surrender terrain to spotters who are guiding, armed drug carriers into the country, I think the dynamics have changed radically. One of the advantages, I believe, on this foreign terrorist organization designation and the details of that, how that plays out, is that it radically changes the dynamic with Mexico. I think the president can say to the Mexican government, we can do this with you, or we can just do it and you can be a spectator. I think that's a very important shift, because people are finally, at least in my view, in the government, people are finally wrapping their arms around this idea of convergence, in the sense that criminal enterprises and terrorist organizations will collaborate and cooperate with one another. They used to be forbidden to say that. They would never do that. The cartels would never ruin their business model by getting involved with terrorists, and that's been, I think, now repeatedly proven not to be true. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at, say, Hezbollah or Hamas or the PLO, all the terrorist groups in the Middle East, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they all mix the two. North Korea, which is the most communist regime that you can think of,
right,
makes money off organized crime, off printing fake dollar bills,
right,
trading drugs, and we know that the leadership of Hamas were millionaires and even billionaires living in Dubai and places like that. Where does all that money come from? It's partly stolen aid money from the Gulf and from people who support them, but it's also the proceeds of criminal enterprise. And the cartels, they're just like the mafia. The Godfather, Vito, didn't want to go into the drug business because he thought that was below him, but most organized crime groups will do whatever they can to make a buck, and they
right,
don't really care who gets hurt.
Right.
So, yeah, I do think there's a nexus, and if you are a TCO or an FTO, foreign terrorist or foreign criminal organization, you want to suborn and buy and own the government, because that way you can be doing your work unimpeded. And that's what's happened in Mexico to a certain degree. These cartels have been able to control and terrorize local governments, kill journalists. It's the highest number of journalists killed in the world is in Mexico.
Right.
And the government is either too afraid or too pathetic to do anything about it.
So here in the United States, we have these leaders of cities and I guess also municipalities, counties, and states, who I prefer to call neo-Confederates. They believe that they can simply ignore federal law, right? They're nullificationists. They say, well, you have a federal law, we don't care, we're not going to cooperate. I think it poses a challenge for President Trump, Tom Homan, Secretary Noem, when she becomes confirmed, but I think it's a beatable challenge. Give me your instincts or your sense, your evaluation of the state of play with these sanctuary city political leaders, sanctuary state political leaders, and the tension between their position and President Trump's orders.
I just read a good report this morning by Paul Larkin, who's with us at the Heritage Foundation, on this question on what can be done about sanctuary cities.
Yeah.
He's got some very technical legal fixes, some actions that Congress could take. But as far as the president goes, why should we be subsidizing these cities and states that have sanctuary rules and that don't cooperate with federal law enforcement? Now, we're not talking about them. We're not asking local police to go raid schools and hospitals and whatever to pick up illegal aliens. That's the job of enforcing immigration law is DHS's.
Right.
It's a federal responsibility, Immigration Customs enforcement and removal operations. But the very least cities and states can do is to cooperate. And for example, if you have a guy who's arrested in the state of Maryland for a crime, and it turns out he has a federal warrant against him, or he's needed to or wanted by ICE for deportation, they should inform ICE. And when ICE says we want to pick him up quietly in the jail where it's safe for him, safe for you, safe for us, safe for the public, they should accept that and go along with it, whatever their private reservations. In the same way that when you were serving and when I was in the government, we didn't get a choice in what we did. We obeyed lawful orders. That's it. And in the same way, so-called sanctuary cities and states should assist the federal government in enforcing our laws until and unless those laws are changed.
So one of the cute little maneuvers that are done is that these state, county, and municipal or city officials will say, well, this ICE detainer is really just an administrative warrant, and we're not bound by administrative warrants. I mean, I think an easy fix for that is simply redefine, and this is a congressional issue, right? They need to just zip out a quick amendment or a linguistic adjustment to change the nature of those warrants, because it's a loophole, right? It's a way for localities to say we're not going to get ourselves involved in this. Because it's not a real warrant, it's an administrative warrant. And as you rightly pointed out, if you got a bad guy and he's in custody at the county jail, why would this is an officer safety issue, it's also a public safety issue. Why would you cut this guy loose and then have federal law enforcement have to go find him, track him down, and apprehend him? When you're talking about the odds of some kind of violence or some kind of horrific, even just bad driving, let alone a shootout, right? Why would you subject the law enforcement officers of the public to this guy being cut loose and on the run? I mean, it doesn't even make sense at all.
No, there's no logic to it. And in fact, we have many cases of that exact horrible scenario playing out. Laken Riley, for example, was killed by an illegal alien who was here, I think in New York to begin with, and was arrested there for something that he could have been charged with, but New York's prosecutors, like LA's, like Philadelphia's, like Chicago's, and so on, don't essentially believe in prosecuting crime at that level.
Yeah, Alvin Bragg, call your office.
Yeah,
right?
Alvin Bragg.
He's more interested in prosecuting Trump over phony charges than actually getting violent criminals off the street.
Exactly. So they let him go. He was then again arrested, I think, for theft. They call it shoplifting. Theft is theft. And he was put, as I understand it, into some kind of restorative justice program or whatever, that they think somehow they can magically turn a recidivist criminal into a law-abiding citizen by being extra nice. And then he murdered this innocent young woman. Right. So that is an example of what can happen when you put the interests of illegal immigrants, dangerous ones, ahead of those of U.S. citizens. You have to wait for someone to get killed before you take it seriously. But you're right. You talk about Alvin Bragg. I was reading yesterday that Larry Krasner, who's a similar prosecutor in Philly, he's talking about prosecuting locally people who were convicted under offenses for January 6, 2021. Instead of trying to tackle the crime rate in Philadelphia, which is at the absolute bottom of all the tables of livability, he's grandstanding and making political points. So this is a problem we have nationally that I think local voters are going to have to fix.
Yeah, this is a really sick, ideologically driven. I mean, they are acting with this sort of rabid fixation, and I use the term advisedly. They're like Bolsheviks. I mean, they're out of their minds when it comes to the advancement of these the endangerment of the public, right? They will do anything to achieve their political ends. It's all about power, and that's why I say it's Bolshevik. It's power-driven process that sets aside public safety to achieve a political goal, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. Looking ahead now, so we've had this really amazing past few days with all sorts of orders and all sorts of initial activity, but this is not going to be solved overnight, which is one of the things that you said when we first opened our conversation here. What are the long haul kind of slog through the fight kind of things that the public needs to kind of brace themselves for and be prepared for? There's long-term consequences. It's not a quick, easy, wave the magic wand, hooray, we're secure. What's the tough stuff that still has to be done?
Well, essentially what happened is you have two philosophies that conflicted. And the first is that there should be open borders, that people all over the world should be allowed to live where they want to live,
right,
and that anything that gets in the way of that is cruel or racist or oppressive. And under the Biden administration, this philosophy played out in real time. When you say that the borders are open, they would go, "Oh, they're not really open." Mayorkas himself said we release 85% of people who show up. And that was a low-end estimate. He said at least 85%.
Right.
And if you look at the numbers, probably 12 million people have been allowed into the country, either as gotaways, so they didn't inspect at all, or paroled in under made-up programs that should never have been
right,
enacted in the first place.
Or really weirdly twisted programs.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
we could talk all day about
Yeah.
that, how that program's been twisted out of all proportion to what it should have been, or just what they call released with a notice to appear. So you get someone, you arrest them. Imagine like on the highways, if all the cops did is they stopped someone driving 90 miles an hour drunk, and they didn't arrest them or charge them. They just said, here's a letter, show up in court in a year,
5
2
years.
years, 5 years,
Right.
and then there'll be a process which will take another 5 years, at the end of which no one will do anything, even if you're ordered to go to jail, we'll just let you go.
Right.
People wouldn't take it seriously, and they would do whatever they want to do.
Well, even the slang term among Spanish speakers, it's a permiso, right?
Yeah.
It's a permission slip. That's how it's referred to, and that's how it's treated.
It is not a serious process that's being started when they release them with those NTAs. So you have that, and then in addition to just letting everybody in, they basically gave up on interior enforcement. I mean, they did some, but they wrote memos telling ICE officers, you can't do it on a Sunday. You got to take into account, is someone having a bad hair day, or did they, just lose their cat? You don't do it near, anywhere near schools or hospitals or churches. Well, you go to any city, schools, hospitals, churches, whatever, they're almost everywhere. Right. So that was so severely limiting what they could do on enforcement that it was practically gone. And then they started to campaign for an amnesty. Saying, well, look, all these people are here. What are you going to do? We need to just, forgive it. So that's the philosophy on the one hand that I believe was firmly rejected in November.
Right.
And the new philosophy has to be going back to the basics. We have a rule of law. You have to deter people from coming in. You have to detain them if they come in illegally for the duration of their due process, which they get. And then if they are ruled to be removable, in other words, they don't win that case that they're trying to make that they deserve protection or asylum, you have to deport them. The 3 Ds. And what we've been doing for the last 4 years is ignoring those statutory and moral, I would say, obligations to preserve our national sovereignty. So that's the challenge for the Trump administration. We've seen already a slew of executive orders that bring back a lot of that deter, detain, deport model. For instance, remain in Mexico, saying you don't get everything you want by showing up and saying that you have a credible fear of persecution. Because everybody says that. You can just Google it and you can read probably in 150 languages the exact words you need to say to let them release you.
Right.
You have to wait in Mexico or somewhere else while we consider your case. Now, if you're an economic migrant from Punjab, you're probably not going to want to waste however many years of your life or months
hanging out
even
in
Mexico when you know that at the end of it you have no credible application for asylum.
Right.
So that's a huge part of it. Finishing the wall so that at least we can dissuade people from coming over in certain places and channel them towards other places where we can put resources to meet them. And doing the domestic enforcement, when you order someone removed, if they've wasted time and resources, and presumably none of these, some of them are paying for their own lawyers, but a lot of them, it's all U.S. government money being spent on both sides. At the end of that case, if you get asylum, well, welcome to America. If you don't, we have to actually carry out that order. Otherwise, it is kabuki theater. It is a waste of all of our time and money, and it makes a mockery of the law, and no one takes it seriously, which is the situation now. So all of those elements need to be brought into play at the same time so that we reestablish our credibility as a sovereign nation. We reestablish the primacy of legal migrants. I'm one, myself. We welcome 1 million people a year, give or take, as legal migrants. And there are people waiting in line who've been waiting, some of them 20, 25 years, for their chance, for their turn.
Right.
We need to put those people ahead of the line instead of people who just happened to show up yesterday. It's a huge challenge, but they've made pretty impressive progress in a couple days, and I really hope to see more over the next few months.
In 2018, I marched along with the migrant caravans in Guatemala, and I had Sarah Carter with me from Fox. I think she was working with Hannity at the time. Our very own Irene Garcia, who's an amazing reporter. And so we decided to go commit an act of journalism and go down there, and instead of talking about it, actually march along with them. And we did for a couple of days. And we interviewed a lot of people. And every time we pulled out a camera and turned it on, guess what was shoved in front of us? Crying women and children. They made up like 1%, right? It was 98% or 99% military age males, 15 to 50. That's who was coming up. But every time we pulled the camera out, all of a sudden, magically, women and children crying were pushed in front of the cameras. That's what's going to happen on these mass deportations. We're going to have crying women and children. We're going to have a lot of hysterical, reckless language about separating families. I got a little news for you. If John Smith, driving up 95, gets pulled over DWI, he's going to jail, he's going to be separated from his family. So does the American public have the stomach? Do we have the guts, the tough love, the kind of hard self-interest? It's actually just sanity, but do we have the stomach for crying women and children, for mass deportations and separating families? Or will the heartstrings be played and Trump's going to be called authoritarian, fascist, and all the usual language? Which way, how does it break? How does it play out?
Well, definitely that card is going to be played. The question is,
For sure.
Is it as strong a card as it was 4 or even 8 years ago?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there were 3 networks plus PBS. There were like 2 newspapers that you could subscribe to, plus your hometown paper, a few magazines. So the press, the media, was a distinct group of people. Now there has been enormous loss of viewership on CNN, PBS. If you look at the Washington Post, they've hemorrhaged viewers and readers.
Right.
And I'm one of them, because they no longer report the news accurately. And I think this last election shows that the power of podcasts, of independent media, of right-of-center media has grown enormously as people lost all confidence after all the lies that they were told about COVID, about January 6th,
Yep.
about, it was never objective. The Trump cases, the coverage of the legal cases against him, which are very interesting, and you could cover them in a balanced way that might provide some ammunition to the other side, but that was never done. So I imagine that there'll still be a percentage of people who will only ever see the crying woman with her child and the sob story, because there are sob stories. If you look at every single case in the justice system, you'd never get anything done, because you'd have to spend all your time sympathizing with people.
And it's always very selective, because, if you want to talk about crying women and children, how about the 325,000 kids the Biden administration lost?
Yeah.
Let's cry about them for a while.
550,000 unaccompanied minors brought here, some of them smuggled into the sex trade, working in meat plants, or sent to people who were not their relatives.
Yeah. Why can't we cry about them? How does that sound? That sounds like a very reasonable thing to do. That if we're going to cry and scream and get all upset about deportations, let's go try to find those 325,000 missing kids. That's probably a good idea. I'm being facetious, not really, but I'm trying to make a point that there's going to be a campaign waged, an information operation to propagandize this. And we need to know it now and talk about it now, so that when they start this maneuver, we have the ability and the language and the argument to fight back.
In the past 2 days, in the United States, I read that an Afghan they said he was a refugee, so I'm not sure where he was in that process, stabbed, I don't know if he killed him, but he stabbed his refugee caseworker, whose job it was to try to assimilate him into our community in Michigan. The day before, in Germany, an Afghan who had applied for asylum but then dropped his claim and was still in the country despite having been ordered to take mental health treatment because he was violent, stabbed and killed a 2-year-old child and a 41-year-old man who tried to stop him. You won't hear about those stories. If you Google refugee, you're not going to see those two guys. But they are also refugees. The population of refugees, just like you said, is a very big one. It's complicated, but you're not going to see that in the legacy media. You're only going to see the most sympathetic cases, and we're going to have to brace ourselves for eggs being broken as the omelet is made.
Right.
But as you said, Sean Puffy Coombs is in jail now. I think he has a few children. He's separated from his family because he's in the justice system due to credible charges. That happens every day when people are arrested. It is very unfortunate. But somehow the left singles out immigration as a complete exception from the normal rules of jurisprudence and law enforcement. And, it's obviously for a political purpose, and we can expect that to happen over the next few years for sure.
So in summation, do you have a positive view? Is Trump going to be able to get the job done, or is this going to get wound, slow walked and nickeled and dimed in courts and through propaganda campaigns? What's the outcome?
It's both. I think if he can't do it, no one can.
Right.
This is not our last roll of the dice, but pretty close.
Right.
What I've seen so far has been very encouraging. I think one of the techniques that he's using, the strategy here, is he's we used to call it belt and braces in law school. He's not just doing one action, he's doing all of it at the same time. Not just an emergency, but an invasion as well. And if you look at the executive orders, they cover so many different areas that if he loses here or there on a tactical level through lawsuits, and as you say, I mean, the ACLU had the lawsuits ready to go long before Trump was even the candidate before he'd won the primaries. I think they're going to make significant progress. I think people have had enough. They saw the experiment of open borders for 4 years, and they said enough. And on other things, too. I mean, the first article I wrote when I retired from the Foreign Service was titled something like, "The U.S. Embassy Should Only Fly One Flag." Secretary Rubio ordered that as policy on Monday. I wrote a piece about 2 weeks ago saying, we should not have an X marker on a passport. Human beings are divided into two sexes, male and female. We can dress.
It's a chromosome issue.
Yeah,
it's just XY.
And we can act how we want. We can sleep with who we want. That's totally irrelevant. But for identification purposes, X doesn't tell you anything about a human being. It shouldn't be in the passport. Well, apparently 2 days ago, that order went out. We will no longer do that. So the progress that's been made has been quick. Yes, there will be reverses. We will lose battles. But I think the restoration of sanity and the rule of law across the board is going to make significant progress in the next 4 years. And I hope people at the end of it appreciate it and decide they want to keep going down that road and not take another U-turn back to where we were last year.
Simon, where can folks follow your work or your social media, or if they're interested in seeing what you're up to? What's the best way for them to follow you?
Google's my friend. I usually Google my own articles just with my name and then a keyword because it always comes so fast. But I'm on Twitter, X, as @WatchfulWaiter1. And I have a column that comes out every week called The Borderline in the Daily Signal, which is published
as part
here
of
in
Heritage.
Washington.
Right, right. I'm going to give you the last word. Anything that we've missed that we need to consider before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate the chance to come on and talk about what might happen in the next 4 years. And I'm very enthusiastic about what's happened so far and hoping it'll keep going.
Simon Hankinson, who's the Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation on Border Security, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.